Hello, I'm Meghan Grebner, news anchor and reporter for Brownfield. We're starting a new venture this week. We're going to do a weekly livestock market roundup, and with us is Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for agreeing to do this program with us. Let's, for our viewers and our listeners, if you could give just a little bit of your background and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Scott Brown. I've been with the University of Missouri for over 25 years now. Work a lot in the cattle and hog industries. I have spent much of my time trying to work with U.S. Congress as they try to write foreign policy related to the livestock industries. Came from a diversified farming operation in very extreme northwest Missouri, so Missouri's home for me in a lot of ways.
Well, we're definitely glad to have you with us. Let's start first a little bit of, and let's do just a weekly roundup of what happened this week in the markets. I know the WASDE numbers or WASDE numbers came out. Let's start first there, and maybe we can get into some more details.
Yeah, so USDA did give us another monthly report this week. I will say, relative to what they had turned out the previous month, not a lot of changes. However, I think we continue to see growth in U.S. per capita meat consumption coming in 2016. When you look at what we've done in both 2015 and 2016, we're up over 12 pounds per person relative to where we were back in 2014. So I think as we look ahead, we're going to continue to see that growing domestic meat supplies, and what has been a tougher export situation is going to mean that U.S. consumers have to eat more meat in 2016, and that's something that we're going to have to watch very closely.
You mentioned the export aspect of it. Is part of that because of the stronger U.S. dollar? Does that play a role in the reduced exports of U.S. meat?
So I do think when you look at what's been happening with the strength of the dollar, that's been very important to what's been happening to U.S. exports of meat products for much of 2015 and now into 2016. I think we're going to continue to watch what happens from a dollar strength standpoint. I will say I think we are getting real demand growth from consumers in other countries for U.S. beef and pork products in particular. But because although our prices might be down in this country, the strength of the dollar has really muted the kinds of declines that we've seen in beef and pork prices here in the U.S. And in some cases, some countries are actually probably seeing prices as high as they were at their peaks as a result of our dollar strength. So it has been a problem. I think when you look at what we got out of January data, we are up slightly relative to a year ago in both beef and pork trade. So, maybe some encouraging news starting to come here in early 2016, but I'm continuing to be very cautious about how much we're going to be able to export of those products as we look ahead here the rest of this year.
You mentioned increasing domestic demand, which is a great thing to make sure our pork producers and beef producers have a place for their product to go. At this point, can we keep up with the processing aspect in the U.S. and when we see these two plants come online that are expected to come on in 2017, how does that play a role in all of that?
Yeah, so I think when you look at hog markets in particular, I will say, fourth quarter of 2016, we're going to have to watch very carefully in terms of what happens. I'm looking very cautiously ahead at what we get out of the report here at Hogs and Pigs report on March 25th. If we're growing a lot in terms of inventories, I could be a little worried about whether or not we have enough shackle space in the last quarter of 2016. I'm not thinking that's a huge issue right now, but not a lot of cushion. So the nice thing is with the plants that we see coming on in 2017, I think it does provide us an opportunity to hang more hogs, and we're going to need to do that in 2017. We're going to continue, I think, to see larger supplies of pork into 2017. The nice thing is getting another announcement yet this week about a potential plant in Mason City, Iowa, I think is nothing but more positive in terms of that capacity that we need on the pork side as we move into 2017. I will sometimes say it's the tale of two cities when you think about beef versus pork. We've lost cattle slaughter capacity because we've been so tight in terms of cattle numbers. I worry much further down the road that we'll wish we had some of that cattle slaughter capacity back once we start growing the herd and actually getting a lot more animals to slaughter. But But right now on the cattle side, we have plenty of capacity still laying there.
We talked a little beef, we've talked a little pork. What about poultry? Any surprises in any numbers or what the poultry markets are doing in recent weeks?
Well, I think when you look at what's been going on in poultry markets, we're continuing to see increases in production there. I think we continued to watch what were things like avian influenza going to do to poultry markets. We haven't seen so far any of the effects similar to what we saw last year. When you look at kind of where we are year to date, I will say, chicken production up a little less than 4% year to date relative to a year ago. Tells us, again, another product where we have more supplies coming to the marketplace. Exports for chicken are also likely not going to grow a lot in 2016. So a situation where we're going to be passing along more chicken to U.S. consumers as well. Domestic demand for all of these meat products is going to be the critical piece, I think, as we look at what price does it take to move that product in markets in this country this year.
What does it take to increase domestic consumption of meat products in the U.S.? We see China increase their consumption, but we've also seen such a rise in their middle class where people can afford it more. So how does that change, or how do we increase the demand here?
Well, I do think a strong domestic economy is the start of that mix. If we can get strong GDP numbers for much of this year, I think that means consumers have more money in their pockets. Although we probably spend a smaller proportion of that gain on meat products in this country relative to somewhere like China, where it is a growing middle class. I think more dollars helps us at the end of the day. As I look at the GDP data, we certainly have a mix of growth. Those lower income folks have probably been struggling more with income growth than the higher end of the spectrum. Getting growth in those lower income levels, I think, is very critical in this country. And I will say, it will likely take some lower livestock prices, lower meat prices, to move additional supplies of products to U.S. consumers. My hope is that demand for U.S. beef, pork, and chicken stays as strong as it's shown the last few years, because we're going to have to move a lot more product to U.S. consumers. If we lose that demand strength that we've seen the last couple of years, it just means we have to move that much lower on prices to really clear markets.
Scott, just to wrap things up this week, let's talk a little bit about some of the numbers that we saw. Any big movements, any big surprises in cattle, pork, and even poultry prices?
I think when you look at this week, we saw a little higher cattle prices emerge, higher feeder cattle prices. Even hog prices up a little bit from the beginning of the week to the end of the week. So a little bit of price strength. We've frankly, for much of this year, been fairly flat in terms of prices as we go across. I think as we look ahead, we're going to continue to stay focused on what do we get out of Hogs and Pigs report. Perhaps even more important on the feed cost side, we're going to continue to watch what's happening in corn and soybean meal prices. Those prices have come down significantly from a few years ago. What kind of crops we get planted for corn and soybeans, and the planting intentions report we're going to get here at the end of the month, I think are all the critical pieces that we're going to have to watch as we look the next few days ahead.
There'll be plenty for us to talk about in weeks to come. Scott, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for having me again.
We'll talk to you next Friday.